Welcome to Dataless You. I'm Paul, coming to you from Brooklyn. Today we are going to take a look at Nietzsche on morality. We're going to pay close attention to his first essay from On the Genealogy of Morals, entitled Good and Evil, Good and Bad. I will be reading from Walter Kaufmann's fantastic translation included in his basic writings of Nietzsche. I'm excited. This is a big, challenging talk. Let's dive right in with a quote from perhaps Nietzsche's most famous work, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. The child is innocence and forgetting, a new beginning, a game, a self-propelled wheel, a first movement, a sacred yes. For the game of creation, my brothers, a sacred yes is needed. So what is Nietzsche getting at in this quote? That is our question for today. That is the investigation. Essentially, he has this image of a child's way of being in the world. And in Zarathustra, he talks about human evolution towards this way of being in the world, a child full of innocence and forgetting. And he uses two other key stages, namely the camel and the lion. And he explains how we as a race are evolving through these stages of self-consciousness towards a higher Übermensch, you might say, that has this more innocent way of being in the world. And this more creative way, this more self-affirming way, life-affirming way. And so, in order to make clear his philosophy, Nietzsche writes a book called Beyond Good and Evil, and begins to explain really the roots of our morality, the sort of genealogy of our ethical positions, our ethical views. And in this earlier work, Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche is trying to explain how we make moral evaluations, and also trying to point out the kind of dark side of our sort of Judeo-Christian ethics, the kind of shadow side of where they come from, the psychological roots of such an ethical system. And so we're going to look at that today and see how Nietzsche brings us through this evolution, through these stages, through this critique and investigation of Western Judeo-Christian ethics, so that we arrive back at this image of a child, and perhaps we can think of being in the world in this creative, self and life-affirming way. So let's get started with a picture here of the man, the legend. This is the young Nietzsche, and just a brief overview of his life. He was born in Prussia in 1844. He died in what was then the German Empire, right at the turn of the century, influenced by Schopenhauer, and you can peruse the bullet points on your own here. I would emphasize that he was asked to become professor of classical philology at the University of Basel at age 24 when he was just a student. This is the dream of all graduate students, to hand in a paper and to have one's professor say, "This will immediately be published. This is genius." And then to be asked, before he's even completed his curriculum or his dissertation, to be a full-on professor. Indeed, Nietzsche was living the dream as a young man. Notice also his famous works and his famous ideas. Quite an array of powerful philosophical ideas that have stayed with us this 100 and plus years. The will to power, perspectivism, God is dead, a famous quote of Nietzsche's, the Übermensch, eternal recurrence, master-slave morality, which we're going to investigate today, and as I've already sort of alluded to, a life-affirming, creation-focused morality. So let's begin with a discussion of Nietzsche's method in On the Genealogy of Morals. In many ways, On the Genealogy of Morals, which is split up into three different essays, is the most accessible of Nietzsche's many brilliant philosophical works. Other works are aphoristic and poetic in nature and tend to be a little bit more difficult and obscure, whereas On the Genealogy of Morals reads like a straightforward essay. The one that we're going to look at today, the first essay, deals very explicitly with, as I've mentioned, the roots of Judeo-Christian morality, particularly in contrast to the aristocratic morality that predates Judeo-Christian morality. So the morality of the Greeks or the Romans, what he calls master morality, or the morality of the ruling class. So as I mentioned, and this is a sort of warning, Nietzsche's view here is critical. He is critical of Judeo-Christian ethics, but he does not propose we just jettison them utterly. He, as I mentioned, is trying just to get us to be aware, to be more self-aware of where we came up with this system, its birth, if you will. And he posits, again, that we're really talking about an evolution of the human spirit, and he's trying to sort of get us over the hump by helping us see more clearly the history of morality. And that really is the key. So take a look here at his method. It's historical. He is critical of English psychologists whose thinking is, as he says, by nature unhistorical. He opens the essay criticizing English psychologists who are asking this question: why by nature do we say that the good is unegotistical, right? And Nietzsche disagrees. He says that's not some sort of universal truth, that the good is by definition, by nature, unegotistical, right? The act that is selfless. Nietzsche says, let's take a closer look and look back in history for an explanation and for an answer to this question. Notice also his method is philological. He's going to look at the roots of words. He was a Latin scholar. He was a master of many languages, and much of his philosophical thought is rooted in linguistics or in philology, in really the history of words. I've written just one German word here, schlecht, and now he makes a connection between schlecht, which is bad, and schlicht, which really just means plain or simple. So hold this linguistic connection in mind. It's going to come back. The connection between a word that now means bad, right, and a word that is very close, linguistically speaking, in terms of the sound of it, the spelling, that just means plain or simple, right? So, the difference between a bad cracker and just kind of a plain or simple table wafer, right? Keep that in mind. And then also, crucially, Nietzsche's method is psychological. So he's going to show how we arrive at our moral evaluations by looking at the psychology of the class of people who invented them, namely the Jews, the early priests, etc. Right? So it's a very interesting method with a focus on history, philology, and psychology. So let's dive right in. Let's take a look at first Nietzsche's view of the morality of the ruling class by looking at a couple of quotes. So here we go. It was, quote, the good themselves, that is to say the noble, powerful, high-stationed, and high-minded, who felt and established themselves and their actions as good, that is, of first rank, in contradistinction to all the low, low-minded, common, and plebeian. Nietzsche uses this perspective to again make the claim that, quote, it follows from this origin that the word good was definitely not linked from the first and by necessity to unegotistic actions. Okay, so I think the easiest way to begin to understand what Nietzsche is talking about when he speaks of the morality of the ruling class is to think of the ancients, to think of the Greeks, to think of the Romans. In fact, at the essay's end, Nietzsche more or less summarizes his view of these competing moralities by saying the Romans embodied master morality, morality of the ruling class, of the victors, of the strong, while the Jews represent the priestly class and the morality of the oppressed, the slave morality, etc. So take a look here at an image of aristocratic Greeks. Here we have Socrates and his famous bust in the center, expounding upon probably the Platonic forms and his other philosophical ideas. And we see other famous Greek figures of philosophy and tragedy sort of lounging about and engaging in philosophical discourse. And to Nietzsche, this class pictured here embodies the master class, the ruling class. They have time to create, which is very important for Nietzsche. They have the luxury of time to invent, to produce beautiful works of art, to make discoveries in the sciences, etc. And it is this masterclass that very naturally, according to Nietzsche, sees everything it does as good and beautiful and truthful. Nietzsche looks fondly back on these ancients and their attitude of we, noble, happy, lucky, productive, thriving ones. We are good. And their sense of morality is very self-projected, right? They merely look at themselves and at all the wonderful creations, all of their triumphs on the battlefields, all of their advancements in the arts and sciences, and they say, we are good. In particular, we are truthful. Nietzsche points to the nobles as predominantly identifying as truthful. I would like to plant the seed now that ultimately Nietzsche's view of master morality is kind of a view of Darwinian morality, right? So, morality of the fittest, of the strong, of the victorious. And I think that that's an important concept to follow throughout this talk, that essentially Nietzsche's presentation of master morality is a kind of defense of our Darwinian nature, of our hardwired need to thrive, to pass our genes on to the next generation, to be the fittest. Okay? So that is one way for us to frame this notion of master morality. Now, before we take a close look at how Nietzsche argues for this master morality through the use of philology, through his examination of ancient language, I'd like first to make a very important point, and that is Nietzsche argues that the way the ancients, and let's start with the Greeks, the way the Greeks used language was entirely unsymbolic in meaning. Their use of purely descriptive language didn't carry the same kind of moral overlay that our use of good and evil now carry. Our use of the word good in particular is so weighted with a moral connotation that it is nearly inconceivable for us to think of the way the Greeks may have described things in a much more narrow and straightforward manner. So before we take a look at the Philology, let me just read you this extended quote from page 467 about the unsymbolic nature of ancient language. It is then, for example, that pure and impure confront one another for the first time as designations of station. And here, too, there evolves a, quote, good and a, quote, bad, in a sense no longer referring to station. One should be warned, moreover, against taking these concepts pure and impure too ponderously or broadly, not to say symbolically. All the concepts of ancient man were rather, at first, incredibly uncouth, coarse, external, narrow, straightforward, and altogether unsymbolical in meaning to a degree that we can scarcely conceive. The pure one is from the beginning merely a man who washes himself, who forbids himself certain foods that produce skin ailments, who does not sleep with the dirty women of the lower strata, who has an aversion to blood, no more, hardly more. Okay, so this is important to keep in mind as we move forward. The language that Nietzsche takes a close look at is, in his view, in his argument, unsymbolic in nature. It merely describes the world without the moral overlay that we are so accustomed to. So let's take a look at some of the words Nietzsche looks at in particular. Let's look at the Philology. Okay, let's see how he uses philology to argue that point. He presents certain words like eslos, which means good or brave. You can see how close it is to our word ethics. And really says that what it really means in the original Greek is one who is, literally, one who is, one who possesses reality, one who is actual, one who is true. And so for Nietzsche, there is this link, linguistically speaking, between merely being alive, being a member of the noble class, being present and actual and real, and being truthful, right? To be is to be true. He looks at other words like agathos, which means good, but also well-born. So you see, the link is very clearly made. The argument is strong. And then he points to the other side of the coin in kakos, meaning bad, but also really meaning ugly or ill-born, mean, craven, or dailos, cowardly, worthless, vile, wretched. So this is a lot of ancient Greek in one foul swoop. But the point is straightforward. Essentially, what all of this linguistic work amounts to is Nietzsche's pointing to the fact that the ancients, in this case the Greeks, would simply point to themselves and say, we are good, we are thriving, we are the fittest, we are happy and truthful, we noble ones. And that they then look to the lower classes, to the slave class, and more than anything, notice that maybe their faces were a little dirtier. They didn't have the luxury of access to the nice city baths that the aristocracy had access to. And more than anything, the upper classes looked to them and said, they are dirty, these lower classes. They are unbathed. And that this was the ancient notion of good, right? The Greeks, the noble ones, we good ones, and bad, the ill-born, the ill-bred, the unwashed lower classes. And that there's something very straightforward in this. Okay, so we have this sense now, right, of the master morality as self-projected, as creative, as Darwinian in a we are the fittest sort of way. Okay? And let's take a look at another list of words that Nietzsche looks at. Nietzsche goes on to look at not just Greek, but Latin. So just peruse the big board here. You see is malice, which means bad, and also milas, which just meant black or dark, particularly the common man, the black-haired man. So you see what I'm getting at? It was descriptive. Bad meant really just they had black hair. It was a physical description nearly. Whereas bonus meant good, but really also meant a warrior, a man of war. And we'll see how this evolves into Nietzsche's famous concept of the blonde beast. Nietzsche also mentions Gaelic Finn, which just meant noble, good, pure, blonde-headed. There we have the first introduction of the blonde beast, which, obviously, famously, the Nazis make terrible use of and misinterpret and misread this concept to a degree, and kind of give Nietzsche the bad name that he has in many corners of the world. He also looks at the German word gut, which basically means good or godlike, and that the Goths, this powerful warrior class, was essentially saying, we are the good, we're gut, the Goths. So, Nietzsche's analysis of ancient language leads him to this conclusion that master morality is self-projected. It is a product of nobles looking at themselves and saying, we are good. We noble, happy, thriving ones. So I want to emphasize that Nietzsche's theory is predominantly a class theory. It's an analysis of how morality in the ancient world was a product of class, how the master class, the Greeks, the Romans, considered themselves. And I want to make a very clear point that this is not a racial theory in any way, shape, or form. I think it's easy to misinterpret Nietzsche and think that he is talking about certain superior races. More than anything, he's talking about certain instances in the past where there has been a ruling class, and he's looking at the morality of the ruling class. And he mentions all different races, from the Greeks to the Romans, to the Goths, to the Japanese nobility. And really what he's talking about is the civilized master classes. And I just want to slow down for a moment here and take a look at page 476 and show how he's talking about how in civilization these people are kept in check by custom, respect, usage, gratitude, and even more by mutual suspicion and jealousy, and who on the other hand in their relations with one another show themselves so resourceful in consideration, self-control, delicacy, loyalty, pride, and friendship. These are the values of the civilized, right? Within the city limits of an ancient Greek city-state, these are the values we would find. Now, very interesting now to note, again, how it seems to me that Nietzsche's analysis of master morality is a kind of analysis of what we might call Darwinian ethics. Because in this very moment in the text, he then talks about how this master ruling class, which shows such consideration, such delicacy within the city limits, how when they venture outside the city limits, they sort of lapse back into this Darwinian state, right? So the state of the warrior, of the conqueror. And the way they treat strangers is, well, not the same as the way they would treat each other. Nietzsche says, once they go outside where the stranger is found, they are not much better than uncaged beasts of prey. So here we see the full portrait of the master class, full of values and standards within the city limits, but then kind of a Darwinian beast outside the city limits. The point is, it is a theory of morality based on an analysis of class, and it has nothing to do with race. Let's take a look here at a specific quote emphasizing that this is not a racial theory, but more a theory of class, an analysis of how these ancient ruling classes behaved. They savor of freedom from all social constraints. They compensate themselves in the wilderness for the tension engendered by protracted confinement and enclosure within the peace of society. They go back to the innocent conscience of the beast of prey. And he specifically mentions certain ruling classes that he thinks of as embodying this ability to incorporate the energy of the blonde beast into their notion of the noble. And he says the Roman, as we've mentioned, Arabian, Germanic, as we've mentioned, Japanese nobility, the Homeric heroes, the Scandinavian Vikings. So as you take a look here at perhaps a Scandinavian Viking, whom I've labeled the blonde beast warrior, think again about how Nietzsche's talking about the warrior class. He's talking about men who went out and hunted and killed and felt a surge of power, a kind of Darwinian, if you will, surge. And I think bringing in Darwin is important here, right? Darwin would argue that humanity's need to see their genes pass on into the next generation defines our behavior. And Nietzsche, in a sense, gives a kind of defense of this old master morality that understood that, yes, to thrive, to be victorious, to create beauty and beautiful works of art, in and of itself is the good. Okay? For example, here is a painting on a vase or something of a giant Polyphemus, the Cyclops that is being blinded by Odysseus. And so this is an example of the kind of ethics, the kind of values that were held in such high esteem by the Greeks. Odysseus, he was a warrior. He was able to slay giants. He was able to slay the Cyclops, blind him. And for that he is honored. He is held in high esteem by the code of master morality. Okay, so let us turn our attention now to the morality of the oppressed, to what Nietzsche calls slave morality. Again, I think if we think of ancient Rome as our kind of focal point, we can think of the Romans, on the one hand, the ruling class, practitioners of master morality, and the Jews, or the slaves, on the other hand, as practitioners of slave morality, or actually inventors of what has become Judeo-Christian morality. A system of ethics that values the downtrodden, the meek, the sick, the poor, the oppressed. As Jesus said, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." Nietzsche recognizes how the slave morality is an act of utter genius in its complete upending of the previous system of ethics. So let us start by taking a look at a couple of quotes to frame our understanding of slave morality. The Jews, that priestly people, who in opposing their enemies and conquerors were ultimately satisfied with nothing less than a radical revaluation of their enemies' values, that is to say, an act of the most spiritual revenge. Nietzsche continues to explain on page 472, the slave revolt in morality begins when resentment, or he uses the French word ressentiment, itself becomes creative and gives birth to values. The resentment of natures that are denied the true reaction, that of deeds, and compensates themselves with an imaginary revenge. Slave morality from the outset says no to what is outside, and this no is its creative deed. So, you hear in these lines Nietzsche's main point, his inspiration, if you will, for this essay, for this entire thesis, for this entire analysis, is his belief that Judeo-Christian morality is essentially a product of resentment. Now, what does that mean? Nietzsche argues that the early Jews, the early priests, they looked outside of themselves in order to begin to define their ethical system. They looked at the ruling class. They looked at the Romans. And they said, you are evil. You are oppressing us. You are torturing us. You are killing us. And let's stop for a moment and keep in mind that that was true, right? The Romans are not the best behaved people of all time by any stretch of the imagination. They oppressed the Jews. They held them as slaves. They then went on to oppress the early Christians. Think of Daniel in the lion's den. They literally would use Christians for sports, throw them into the Colosseum and watch lions attack them, etc. So the sense of looking outside and saying you are evil has a lot of validity, has a lot of historical accuracy. But the point that Nietzsche is trying to make is that, nevertheless, the entire ethical system is rooted in resentment. It's a class of people looking outside, looking at the ruling class and saying, I resent you, I see you as evil, and by default, I see myself as good, the downtrodden, the meek, the weak. And Nietzsche sees how the Jews or the early Christians really exacted their revenge on the ruling class by inventing Judeo-Christian ethics. And he recognizes and points to the utter genius of this invention. He calls it the most spiritual revenge, an act of immense creativity and imagination, to take a pre-existing system of ethics, as we've discussed, master morality, I am noble, I am good, I'm thriving. You, the lower classes, are dirty or a little bit more unwashed, you have black hair, that's unusual to us nobles, etc. Right? And the genius of these early priests is to upend that system and to look at what was good in mass morality and say, that is evil. That is everything that is wrong with the world. And then to look at themselves, the meek, the poor, the weaker class, and say, we are good. And it's rather interesting. It's a brilliant re-evaluation of values. And this becomes sort of Nietzsche's own project. He wants to re-evaluate our values. Once he's recognized this root, this problematic root in Judeo-Christian ethics, namely resentment, right? An entire ethical system built on resentment, the resentment of the oppressed. He says we might want to take a closer look at this and see if there are in fact problems, sort of cracks in the foundation. And I think that for Nietzsche, the crux of it is he thinks morality should start with the self. Somebody should look to their own behavior and say, I am good, I am magnanimous, I am generous, I am loyal, etc. As opposed to starting your system of ethics by looking externally and saying that over there is evil, right? So that's the essential difference between these two systems. Ultimately, what we have here is an analysis of the roots of Judeo-Christian ethics that essentially uncovers what I call the shadow side, the kind of dark side, the kind of negative psychology at its base. And Nietzsche does use very strong language to describe the resentment, the great hatred of these early priests. In fact, he goes so far as to call the early priests the great haters of the world. And here's a quote where Nietzsche says that. He said, "The priests are the most evil enemies because they are the most impotent. It is because of their impotence that in them hatred grows to monstrous and uncanny proportions, to the most spiritual and poisonous kind of hatred." And Nietzsche is concerned about this hatred as the root of the entire ethical system of the West. And so he goes out of his way to provide evidence of the resentment. He talks about how in the Bible it is said that the kingdom of God will be ours one day, right? So there's this sort of promise that yes, one day the meek will inherit the earth. Nietzsche says, what is all the faith and the hope for? He says, these weak people, someday or other, they too intend to be the strong, right? There is no doubt of that. Someday their kingdom too shall come. So he shows in this desire for sort of God's heaven on earth, the establishment of God's kingdom on earth, this intense desire for revenge. And then he brings in some heavy hitters as further defense. He quotes Thomas Aquinas, the great teacher and saint, saying, "The blessed in the kingdom of heaven will see the punishments of the damned in order that their bliss be more delightful to them." So that quote by Thomas Aquinas rather succinctly shows how there is this desire for revenge, at least again in the early text, right, in the sort of incipient moment in the birth of this system of ethics. There's this desire to see the former master class burning in hell, right, being punished for their evil, and the former slave class, the meek and the downtrodden, rising and seizing the kingdom that is rightfully theirs. And Nietzsche quotes Tertullian at length in the original Latin. Fortunately, we have the translation here in the footnote. And if you're not convinced of the resentment argument, right, that resentment is sort of at the crux of the foundation of this ethical system, take a look at this long quote by Tertullian where, a rather passionate writer, sort of a very a flowery writer, a writer of great intensity, he sort of lets himself go as he discusses the bliss that the Christians will feel as they watch those former masters punished for their evil deeds. And I'm just going to read a bit here from 45 in the footnote. It says, "Governors of provinces too, who persecuted the Christian name in fires more fierce than those with which in the days of their pride they raged against the followers of Christ, will burn." Right? And it kind of goes on and on and on. And I'm not going to read this sort of intense, resentment-filled, hatred-filled passage about this ultimate sort of, again, upending when the meek inherit the earth and the masters are punished. But bringing in the Thomas Aquinas quote in this long Tertullian passage does help Nietzsche make his case that, at least in the early text, one can really get a sense, a feel for the resentment at the crux of this re-evaluation of values. So as we take a look here at a monk who seems like a nice guy, I want to offer a sort of way out if this thesis makes you uncomfortable. And I've been reading a lot about Nietzsche and this essay on the Genealogy of Morals, and one author presents a fairly good option, and that's you don't have to buy Nietzsche's whole thesis. You don't have to buy that the Jews or the early Christians were so full of resentment that they sort of upended the ethical system and created what we now know of as Judeo-Christian ethics, an ethics of compassion for the meek and the downtrodden. But as this author proposes, we should at the very least notice the utter genius in Nietzsche's analysis that resentment could in fact be the sort of cause of ethical judgments. Maybe even on a personal level, right? If you look at your own mind and how you go about making judgments, do you ever make an ethical judgment more based on resentment than on fact or whatever else you may judge, make your judgments based on? So, at the very least, there's something interesting in contemplating, as we look here at another monk, an ascetic monk practicing probably self-denial and, again, the sort of opposite ethics of the master class. As we look at this picture, we could think of at least accepting Nietzsche's basic analysis that there are two very different ethical systems at work here. The master morality and a slave morality. The morality of the ruling class and the morality of the oppressed. So, what does that mean for us here in modernity? Well, Nietzsche makes clear, as does Walter Kaufmann at a point, that for us modern people, we're a mix of these ethical systems. Yes, Judeo-Christian ethics dominates. It has sort of been the primary source of our ethics for quite some time now. But in any one soul, in any one mind, there are tensions, there are contradictions between these kind of competing views, these competing ethical systems. Now, Nietzsche does not propose, as I mentioned, that we just jettison all of Judeo-Christian ethics. I think it's very important to sort of address this possible argument against Nietzsche. Are we just going to throw away, pity and compassion for the poor? No, that is not what is going on here. Nietzsche does not recommend that. That is not his argument. He is merely, as I've said, trying to get us to be more aware of where these systems sort of came from and what is at their root. Of course, to have compassion for the poor is a good thing, right? That's not the problem. So what really is Nietzsche's problem then with Judeo-Christian Western ethics? What is the takeaway here? And I think to explain what the sort of criticism sort of actually means in the end, we could take a look at a quote here by Walter Kaufmann. What Nietzsche opposed in Christian morality was not, as is often claimed, a human attitude. On the contrary, what he opposed were such features as these: resentment an antagonism against excellence, a predisposition in favor of mediocrity or even downright baseness, a leveling tendency, the conviction that sex is sinful, a devaluation of both body and intellect in favor of the soul, and the devaluation of this whole world in favor of another. In the end, he suggests that all these traits are rooted in resentment. So this gives us a sense of perhaps the takeaway. We read Nietzsche, we come to this deeper understanding of the roots of Judeo-Christian ethics, but what does it actually mean, right? What can we take away from this essay? And I think in these lines you get a sense of Nietzsche's, very sort of practical criticism. He doesn't like the way we sort of devalue the body in favor of the immaterial soul. He finds it's somewhat problematic that we devalue this earthly life in favor of the next life. These are genuine concerns, right? And Nietzsche doesn't like, as he says, the sort of leveling tendency towards mediocrity, etc. In other words, Nietzsche wants to, again, make space for strength, for that kind of Darwinian instinct, for thriving, right? For creation and the power that creation mandates or requires, right? So Nietzsche is trying to find a way for us to make room for really strength and human power. He goes on to write about the will to power, right? And again, I think Nietzsche is just one of these writers who's so easy to misinterpret. If you're just sort of reading him on the surface, the will to power can kind of sound like an awful idea. But it has to be sort of read in context and read very carefully. The criticism of Judeo-Christian ethics is in some straightforward way saying, yes, we must have compassion for the weak, but yes, we should also sort of make room in our ethical system for human strength and for power and for that sort of Darwinian aspect of us that is actually very real and very much a part of the human condition. So to me, that's the takeaway from this criticism. And furthermore, I'd like to sort of just make one little brief connection to a very real world issue. The Bush administration, right? Or sort of the Republican Party in general, maybe the conservative right, whatever you want to call that sort of faction of American politics. They, or it in particular, seems to embody these tensions, right? The religious right is sort of obviously or supposedly the party of Christianity, right? They represent sort of that aspect of the American experience, right? And yet at the same time, this same political party, the Republicans, also very much values a little bit more of this Darwinian master morality, right? You might look at their defense of free markets, right? And that the individual needs the freedom to be an entrepreneur, to thrive in the market without government interference, and that power play, right? Essentially, that sort of Darwinian free market thing needs to be left alone, right? And so you see, there's contradiction, in say the Republican Party. You remember when Bush was making the case to invade Iraq, and they sort of said Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction. Turned out he didn't, and so forth. But it later came out that sort of the Bush-Cheney wing of that administration considered themselves what they called reality creators, right? Well, there's a term, if ever there were one, that sounds like master morality. They sort of know that they are the rulers of the earth, and they sort of know that what they say goes. What they say is, getting back to that notion of we truthful, we noble ones. And so I see in the Republican Party this kind of tension, right? This kind of contradiction, or really just this tension between these two competing ethical views. And I think thinking about these kind of issues in this light, in this historical light, is helpful, right? It kind of helps me wrap my mind around some of these fundamental tensions in our political sphere. So, in summation, perhaps one day we can evolve towards this image of a child that Nietzsche talks about and that I began this lecture with. So I'd like to go back to that quote from Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And before we read it, keep in mind that Nietzsche speaks of an evolution of human consciousness, an evolution of human morality through these stages, right, of the camel, sort of the ascetic, the self-denying, the morality of the oppressed, through the lion, the blond beast, the warrior, the morality of the master class, and he arrives at this third and latter stage of the child, full of innocence and forgetting, a child full of the word yes, yes, yes. And I think Nietzsche really has a vision here. And when he speaks of our moving beyond good and evil, moving beyond some of the ways we think now about morality, moving into some higher stage where we can be more like a child, is worth contemplation. So I leave you with this quote. The child is innocence and forgetting, a new beginning, a game, a self-propelled wheel, a first movement, a sacred yes. For the game of creation, my brothers, a sacred yes is needed. That's all for now. Thank you for joining me today. We've analyzed Nietzsche on the Genealogy of Morals, the first essay, Good and Bad, and Good and Evil. Hope you have enjoyed our talk. I hope it's given you some thoughts. I heartily encourage you to pick up the text yourself and read through it. I prefer the Kaufman translation. And that's it. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the future.